Good morning to everyone here. Happy Sabbath to you all, and to everyone out there on the webcast. I'm glad you can join us all here. Now, the first part of what I'll be covering this morning will be on the geography of the Gospels. Now, the main focus will be on the areas outside of Jerusalem. We'll look at the geography of Jerusalem in a future Bible study as we work through this harmony of the Gospels. Now, before we dive in, can I have a show of hands of who here has actually had the opportunity to travel to Israel? Just Jess and Roxy at the back there. Okay, good. Well, it's a wonderful place that I've been blessed to go to twice myself. First time I went there was in 1999 for about 3 days after nearly 5 weeks of touring Europe and Egypt with a couple of friends from Sydney. And the other time was in 2008 during the week of unleavened bread. Now, from a geographical point of view, the first thing we need to understand is why God chose the land of Israel to give to Abraham's descendants through Jacob. Now, the land of Israel is situated at the intersection of the 3 great continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. Now, it sits in a narrow tract of fertile land in between the 2 great ancient regions and empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia. Now, in Ezekiel 5, verse 5, God said the following about Jerusalem. It says he has set her in the centre of the nations with countries around her. Now, Israel as a nation was meant to draw and attract the Gentiles to God as they saw and observed what God was doing through Israel. Now, this sinks in very well with what Jesus said to his followers in the Sermon on the Mount when he says that we are to be a light to the world in a city that is set on a hill. We are to be a visible display of what it's like to live God's way of life. Now, Israel is a small country. Now, the expression from Dan to Beersheba is used a number of times to refer to the whole length of the nation. Now, the distance between Dan in the north and Beersheba in the south is about 250 kilometres. Now, it's actually a lot narrower going east to west. Now, from Tel Aviv to the Jordan River is only about 70 kilometres, or about the distance for us to drive from here to the Gold Coast. So it's a pretty narrow piece of land. Now, going through the land from north to south are 4 very important ancient trade routes. Now, the most important is the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea, noted here as the coastal highway, which linked Egypt with Assyria and Babylon in the area of Mesopotamia. Now, the other major international road was the King's Highway, which went south along the eastern side of the Jordan. Now, the Road of the Patriarchs, or the Ridge Route, split off the Via Maris in the Jezreel Valley and then went south along the ridges of the hill country of Samaria and Judah. Now, it passed many important cities like Shechem, Bethel, Jerusalem, and Hebron before dropping in altitude to reach Beersheba. Now, the last major route was the Rift or Jordan Valley route. Now, most travellers from from the Galilee region would tend to go south along this road before ascending up to Jerusalem after they got to Jericho. Now, they could also go via the Ridge route, as we see Jesus choosing to go this way when he chose to go through Samaria. Now, the entire Jordan River Valley from Tel Dan, up in the very north, right down to the Dead Sea at some point in time in the past, sank below sea level. Now, one very surprising fact that I only found out after my travels there was that the Sea of Galilee itself is actually 200 metres below sea level. And further south at the Dead Sea, it's actually twice that depth. Now, after Herod the Great died, the region of Galilee was ruled by his son Herod Antipas. Now, Herod Antipas had 2 capitals. Now, one was Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, named after the emperor at the time. Now, despite its closeness to where most of Jesus' ministry was based, the Gospels strongly hint that Jesus avoided going there. Now, the other capital was Sepphoris, which is very close to Nazareth. Now, it was getting a huge upgrade during the time of Jesus' early years that he spent in Nazareth. Now, Jesus' first miracle was in the town of Cana, which is north of Sepphoris and Nazareth. And Jesus moved to Capernaum, and most of his ministry was centred around 3 cities on or near the northern coast of the Sea of Galilee. Now, those 3 cities are Capernaum, Chorazin, and Bethsaida. Now, one other city I've noted on this map here is the town of Magdala on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. Now, this is where Mary Magdalene came from. And in recent years, they've uncovered a small synagogue there. Now, Jesus, we know, was born in Bethlehem. Now, Joseph and Mary were actually living at Nazareth at the time, but they ventured back to their ancestral city of Bethlehem to enrol in the Roman census at the same time they went to Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, the name Bethlehem means house of bread, which is quite appropriate, as Jesus said that he was the living bread. Now, Bethlehem was where Jacob's wife Rachel died and was buried, as noted in the centre of this aerial photo here. Now, it was also the home of Ruth and Boaz, and where King David also came from. Now, to the south of Bethlehem, which you can see in the top left of that aerial photo, is the Herodium. Now, the Herodium was a man-made mountain with a great palace and fortress on its inside. Now, Herod literally moved a nearby hill and placed it on top of another to create this Herodium. Now, did Jesus perhaps have this feature in mind when he spoke about having faith as a mustard seed that could literally move a mountain? Now, there's a principle in Jewish teaching called how much more, in the sense that if man can do this, then how much more can God do? So if Herod can move a mountain, then how much more can God do? Now, Luke 4:16 says that Jesus went to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. Now, later in Matthew 13, the locals asked, "From where does this man have this wisdom and these mighty works? Is this not the carpenter's son?" Now, their quizzical response to Jesus may indicate that after he grew up and entered his 20s, that Jesus had been away from Nazareth for a fairly long time. Now, it seems very surprising in such a small town as Nazareth that the locals spoke as if they were unaware of either his wisdom or power, or so he may have been away for some time. Now, there are some legends that suggest he may have actually went to Britain with his uncle Joseph of Arimathea, where most of Britain's tin and copper came from. Now, shown here in the top left photo, this is what's called Nazareth Village. Now, this was began about 1997, and it was meant to portray what village life would have been like in the time of Jesus. Now, before they started work on this particular site, they did an archaeological survey, and it turned up some rather interesting finds. Now, remains of farming terraces dated by pottery to the 1st century were discovered. Now, also discovered were the remains of not one but 3 harvest watchtowers from around the same time, where farmers would live in during harvest time to guard their crops. Now, Jesus made reference to one of these harvest towers in a parable in Matthew 21. Now, he also says in that same parable that the landowner dug a winepress. Now, at the time, they also found dug into the bedrock a winepress where grapes could be thrown into, and workers would then tread the grapes, through which a narrow channel would then channel the juice into a larger chamber that collected it, and where it would then be fermented. Now, Nazareth backs onto a cliff face called Mount Precipice, overlooking the Jezreel Valley, which you can see in the photo on the left. Now, in Jesus' day, Nazareth was a very small town with only a few hundred people. Now, today, though, it is a sprawling city. Now, in Nazareth, there's a church that was built over an early synagogue called the Synagogue Church, shown on the right here, which is traditionally believed to be the synagogue where Jesus preached in. Now, Jesus was almost killed by the very townfolk that he grew up with. Now, after quoting examples of God's mercy to the Gentiles over the Israelites, they took him to a cliff in order to stone him. Now, Mount Precipice on the left here is a 2-hour walk from that synagogue church, so perhaps the hilltop at the top of the photo on the right may have been the more likely location where they attempted to stone him. Now, this story where they turn on him after he quotes God's examples of mercy to the Gentiles illustrates the extreme xenophobia amongst some pockets of the Jews against the Gentiles that Jesus and the apostles had to contend with at times. Now, not far from Nazareth, ruins were discovered only a few decades ago of a large city called SEPPHORIS. Now, this city was being built at the same time as Jesus was growing up, though many of its Roman features, such as the collated street and theatre, date from after the time of Jesus. Now, as I said, Nazareth was a small town at the time, and not much building was going on there. So it is likely that Jesus' father, Joseph, and perhaps Jesus himself, did some building work in Sepphoris. Now, Sepphoris was actually a city on a hill, as per what Jesus referred to in the Sermon on the Mount. Now, there's also a Jewish rebellion against Roman rule where, when Herod the Great died, and some 2,000 people were actually crucified here. Now, Jesus may have drawn on this experience when he was talking about taking up your cross. Now, John the Baptist's main place of baptizing was at a place called Bethabara on the eastern side of the Jordan. Now, this was the location where Elisha and Elijah crossed the Jordan after the waters were parted, and where Elijah was then taken off into the heavens in a chariot of fire. Now, John the Baptist came in the spirit and the power of Elijah, and so he baptized here and dressed like Elijah to emphasize that he was calling the people back to God, just as Elijah was doing. Now, going back further, this was also the place where the Israelites crossed over the Jordan into the Promised Land. Now, in John 3:23, it says that John also baptized at Aenon because there was much water there. Now, Aenon is about halfway up the Jordan Valley before you get to the Sea of Galilee. And the word Aenon actually means many springs. Now, in addition to Galilee, Herod Antipas was given control of the area to the east of the Jordan River called Perea. Now, to its north and east was the region known as the Decapolis. Now, to the east of the Dead Sea, Herod had a palace at a place called Machaerus. Now, this was actually where John the Baptist was imprisoned and later beheaded for his opposition to Herod Antipas's unlawful marriage. Now, Jesus did not choose to base his ministry out of Nazareth, where he was raised, but in Capernaum on the Sea of Galilee. Now, this is one of the more beautiful places in the land and one of my particular favourites. Now, to be in a nice place on the water might have been part of the motivation, but I think the main reason was probably more strategic. Now, there's one messianic prophecy that Jesus fulfilled at the start of Isaiah 9, which talks about how those in Galilee and the old tribal lands of Zebulun and Naphtali have seen a great light. Now, it also mentions by the way of the sea. Now, the way of the sea here is not a generic term, but a geographical reference. It refers to that great ancient highway that ran past Capernaum, called the Via Maris, which is Latin for way of the sea, as it later goes along the Mediterranean coast after it reaches Caesarea en route to Egypt. Now, basing his ministry in this location on the Via Maris allowed word of what Jesus did and taught to be spread far and wide by those who travelled through Capernaum. Now, this is part of how his fame spread throughout the whole land. Now, there was also a Roman garrison stationed there, and we meet the centurion who was stationed there in the Gospels. Now, also collecting tax for the Romans at the strategic place was Matthew Levi, who Jesus called to be one of his disciples. Now, Mark 2:1 we read, "And again he entered into Capernaum after some days, and it was heard that he was in the house." Now, in the parallel account in Matthew 9, it says that he came to his own city, indicating Capernaum was where he was living. So whose house was this? Now, did Jesus have his own separate place, or did he live with Simon and Andrew, who had recently moved there from Bethsaida? We're not actually specifically told. Now, Mark 1:21, it says that Jesus entered the synagogue at Capernaum. Now, there are the remains there today of a synagogue in Capernaum that you can visit today. Now, its upper white section of white marble is from 300 years after the time of Jesus, but the basalt foundation would be from the time of Jesus. Now, in Luke 7, we read of the healing of the centurion's servant. Now, his garrison was based nearby, and the Jews said that he loves our nations and has built us a synagogue, the same synagogue that Jesus was teaching in. Now, after he came out of the synagogue at Capernaum in Mark 1, he entered the house of Simon Peter and Andrew. Now, the Franciscans in excavating Capernaum found the remains of a 5th century octagonal Byzantine church. Now, under that church was another church with evidence of plastered walls. And underneath that church were remnants of a simple house with rooms around a courtyard. Now, coins, pottery and lamps were found on the house, dating it to the 1st century. Fishing hooks and items indicated that it was occupied by fishermen. Now, Etheria in the 300s AD wrote that a church had been built over what was believed to have been Peter and Andrew's house. Now, Capernaum, because of the hard basalt in the area, was also a centre for the manufacture of millstones as well as olive oil. Now, near the house of Peter is this millstone and an olive press. Now, the initial squeezing of olives was done on the millstone, and then the crushed olives would be placed under the olive press to be squeezed even more for its precious olive oil, which was used for lighting, cooking, anointing, and other purposes. Now, the Greek word for an olive press was Gethsemane, as in the Garden of Gethsemane. Now, like an olive press, Jesus had the weight of the world's sins pressing down on him and squeezing out his lifeblood. Now, Jesus would often use very vivid imagery to teach lessons about the right way to live. Now, one of these is found in Mark 9:42, where we read, "And whosoever shall offend one of these little ones who believe in me, it is better for him that a millstone were hung around his neck and he were cast into the sea." Now, imagine that millstone there being hung around your neck and being cast into the nearby Sea of Galilee. You really get the impression that God takes very serious the way that we treat those people that we might think of as little ones or unimportant. Now, we read in John 1:44 that 3 of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, Peter and Philip, came originally from Bethsaida. Now, as we just saw, Andrew and Peter later moved to Capernaum. Now, a tell which is higher up and inland from the shore has traditionally been identified as Bethsaida. Now, despite the abundance of fishing hooks, this site is too high to have been along the shoreline in Jesus' day, as Capernaum would have been underwater if that was so. Now, recently, another better site shown here as El Araj has been unearthed, including the remains of a Roman bathhouse, and it appears to be a better candidate for the biblical Bethsaida, just near where the Jordan enters the Sea of Galilee. Now, a few kilometres drive north of the Mount of Beatitudes is another town where Jesus preached, Chorazin. Now, this is a fascinating site to visit if you're ever in Israel. Now, there are ruins of an early Jewish synagogue, and an example, one of the very few examples of a Moses seat that has been found, which is where the person doing the weekly reading of the Torah would sit. Now, in the bottom left photo here, you can see me reading on the Moses seat, reading the Torah. Now, the traditional site where Jesus gave the Sermon on the Mount is the Mount of Beatitudes, a short drive west of Capernaum. Now, there's a lovely memorial church there which has been built, and the location gives us this absolutely beautiful, wonderful panorama of the Sea of Galilee. Now, the northern half of the Roman province of Judea was called Samaria. Now, on an early trip back from Jerusalem, Jesus went via the ridge route back to Galilee, going through Samaria, where he met a Samaritan woman at a well near Shechem. Now, John 4:12 is the only reference that we have of Jacob digging a well here. Now, today you can actually visit and drink from what is believed to be this very same well. Now, Mark 7:31 we read, "Departing from the region of Tyre and Sidon, he came through the midst of the region of Decapolis to the Sea of Galilee." Now, Decapolis means 10 cities. Now, it was attached to the Roman province of Syria further north. Now, it was mostly Greek-speaking, and its cities were predominantly Greco-Roman in culture, with all the usual Greco-Roman facilities in them. Now, among them were cities such as Gerasenes, Gadara, Philadelphia, Pella, from which the church fled to before Jerusalem was destroyed, and Bethshean, which was known in Jesus' day as Scythopolis. Now, Jesus probably had this region in mind when he gave his parable about the prodigal son. Now, the Decapolis was like the faraway country the prodigal son went to that was entrenched in the hedonistic and pagan Greco-Roman culture. Now, near the end of his ministry, before he went to Jerusalem to give his life for the world, Jesus said in Matthew 16:18, "I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build the church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." Now, when Jesus spoke these words to his disciples, he'd take them up to Caesarea Philippi, up near Tel Dan and the source of the Jordan River. Now, at Caesarea Philippi, there was a pagan temple to the Greek god Pan, who was half man, half goat. Now, it was near the great cave from which an underground spring fed the waters that fed the Jordan River. Now, from a Greco-Roman perspective, this cave literally was a gate to hell, or the underworld, as the Greek word used for hell here is Hades, which means both the grave and the underworld where the dead go to. Now, the great rock cliff face where the spring came out was also known as the Rock of the Gods, which is why Jesus himself talks about himself as the rock on which the church was built. Now, this location would have made a dramatic impression as Jesus talked about the kingdom of God versus the kingdom of Satan, where Jesus pronounced that the kingdom of God would ultimately be victorious. Now, so that brings us to the end of our look at the geography of Israel during the time of Jesus. Now, I'd like to recommend a few excellent resources to you on Israel's geography. Now, one of the best sites for photos of Israel is BiblePlaces.com. Now, the photo sets they sell on this site also include PowerPoints with all the photos from these sets. Now, they also sell one of the best Bible atlases you'll run across called the Satellite Bible Atlas. I brought my own copy here along if anyone wants to have a quick look at it. The author of this Satellite Bible Atlas also has a YouTube channel called the Satellite Bible Atlas, naturally, with some great videos from different areas of Israel. Now, another excellent book I could recommend is one that covers all the major sites in Israel by Todd Fink, with photos and historical background on each of the major sites in Israel. He's got a terrific website and YouTube channel with lots of great videos shot on location with high-res drone footage of most of the major biblical sites. God willing, I plan to be going on one of his guided tours through Israel in a couple of years' time, which includes sites in the West Bank like Shechem and Shiloh that are dripping in Bible history that often get missed on other tours by other tour groups. Okay, now what I'm about to cover now is an abridged version of a previous young adults Bible study that I gave via Zoom when we were still back in lockdown, where I covered the historical and cultural background of the Gospels. Now, some of the material on Remez that I covered in that Joe is going to mention shortly in his presentation. Now, Daniel prophesied that there would be 4 great Gentile kingdoms. Now, the fourth of these was the Roman Empire. Now, the Jewish rulers, known as the Maccabees, gained power after the war that was precipitated by the defilement of the temple by a Greek ruler named Antiochus Epiphanes, that the Bible refers to as the abomination of desolation. Now, after they gained power, they had a turbulent, Game of Thrones-like 100-year period of independence. Now, having had that recent period of independence, this fed the Jews' very strong desire for independence in the time of Jesus. Now, after the Maccabean queen, Salome Alexandria, died, her two sons divided into civil war. Now, one of them was silly enough to bribe the Roman general Pompey to side with him. And then Pompey then took advantage of the invitation by conquering Jerusalem and the Maccabean kingdom in 63 BC, thus bringing it into the Roman Empire. Now, the Roman Republic, which was ruled by the Roman Senate, was severely destabilised in a series of civil wars and political conflict, during which Julius Caesar, who had conquered much of France, was appointed as perpetual dictator and then assassinated in March of 44 BC. Now, civil wars broke out again, culminating in the victory of Caesar's adopted son Octavian over Mark Antony and Cleopatra in 31 BC, when he also conquered Egypt. Now, he took the title Augustus Caesar. Now, Caesar, which means ruler, Caesar means ruler, as it does also very similar. In Hebrew, the word for ruler is Tsar. In Russian, and of course, we have also in Russian Tsar and German Kaiser. Now, when Isaiah refers to the Messiah as the Prince of Peace, Prince is also translated from that word Tsar, S-A-R. Now, Augustus Caesar was the first Roman emperor, and he ruled for 40 years from 27 BC to 14 AD. Now, as you can see from the statue of him in the middle, he was also quite the fan of disco dancing. Now, Jesus was born during his reign. Now, his successor and his son was his son Tiberius, who was Roman emperor at the time of Jesus' ministry and death. Now, after Rome took over Judea in 63 BC, Pompey's Judean representative, Hyrcanus, was succeeded by his courtier, Antipater the Idumean, as the Roman procurator over Judea. Now, Antipater was the father of Herod the Great, who was an Idumean, or a descendant of Edom. Now, Herod the Great was raised in the Jewish religion, even though he was an Edomite. Now, Herod the Great then ruled under the Romans from 37 BC to 4 BC. Now, the reason that the first Herod was called the Great probably had a lot to do with his building accomplishments. Now, Herod had some very talented builders working for him, and he built many great building achievements. Now, we saw one just previous that was south of Bethlehem, called the Herodian. Now, another of Herod's great building projects was his palace with 3 tiers, with great pools and mountain views at Masada. Now, Herod constructed a larger and more elaborate temple in Jerusalem. Now, while that temple was destroyed in 70 AD, another great building that Herod built still stands intact today in Herod, shown on the right, shown on the bottom left here. Now, it stands over the holy site of the cave of the patriarchs, where Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and their wives were buried, called the Tomb of the Patriarchs. Now, Herod also built a great maritime port and palace in the Mediterranean Sea at Caesarea. Now, at Caesarea, there's a Roman theatre and a hippodrome for chariot racing. And you might be able to see at the top of the photo on the right here the great water aqueduct he built to help bring in fresh water. Now, Herod the Great died in 4 BC around Passover time, and in his will he divided his kingdom up amongst his sons. Now, the sons all contested the will, naturally, and went to see the emperor in Rome. Now, there was a contingent of Jews that also went to Rome to tell the emperor that they'd had enough of the Herods and not to give Herod Archelaus rule over them. Now, Augustus honoured Herod the Great's will And when Herod Archelaus returned, he tracked down those Jews who tried to persuade the emperor not to give him Judea, and he brutally killed them and their families. Now Herod's son, Herod Archelaus, killed the Jews, and that protested his taking over Judea. But, would you believe, 10 years later, in 6 AD, another contingent of Jews, despite the risk to their own lives, again appealed to Augustus Caesar to have Herod Archelaus removed because of how badly he was ruling. Now this time, though, they actually succeeded, and Augustus Caesar removed him as ruler over Judea. Now Herod's other two sons, though, continued to rule in Galilee and further north, but Rome began to more directly rule Judea in the south of Israel by appointing a Roman prefect over Judea. Now Pontius Pilate, who we read about in the Gospel, started his reign 20 years later and was the 5th Roman prefect ruling over Judea for 10 years. Now it's interesting in Luke 19 that Jesus spoke of a nobleman going afar to receive a kingdom, and then while he was away, the citizens who hated him sent a delegation to not have this man over us, which didn't succeed, and then the nobleman had those citizens killed. Now it's fascinating in this kingdom parable how Jesus draws on an experience of one of the kings of his day that his audience would have been quite familiar with. Now you can see echoes of what happened when Herod Archelaus went to Rome and dealt with those who didn't want him to rule over them. Now Parthia, to the east of the Roman Empire, is a forgotten ancient superpower that was based around the area south of the Caspian Sea, where the Assyrians had previously deported the house of Israel 700 years earlier. Now, Stephen Collins makes a strong historical case to support his view that the ruling class was descended from those so-called lost tribes of Israel. Now, while its empire included different ethnic peoples, a great many Israelites and Jews who didn't return from Babylon resided in that empire. Now, the Euphrates formed part of its western border with the Roman Empire. Now, Josephus alludes to this when he speaks of where the so-called lost tribes were in the 1st century. Now, Josephus wrote, "The 10 tribes are beyond the Euphrates till now and are an immense multitude and not to be estimated by numbers." Now, they were an immense multitude living within the Parthian Empire. Now, before Herod the Great ruled, the Parthians had heavily defeated Rome twice in 53 BC and 37 BC. Now, the Parthians briefly ruled Palestine between 40 and 37 BC, and Rawlinson notes that the Jews found their rule preferable to Roman rule. Now, there was a ceasefire of hostilities between the two great empires that followed this second great Roman defeat. And in 1 AD, when another war seemed imminent, Parthia and Rome avoided hostilities diplomatically as each army stood on either side of the Euphrates. Now, it then became Roman policy at this time not to do anything that would provoke a war with the Parthians, who had kicked their behinds twice before. Now, the Roman historian Strabo wrote, "The council of the Parthians consists of 2 groups, one that is of the kinsmen and the other that of the wise men and magi, from which both of which the kings were appointed." Now, this background of Parthia helps to explain certain events in the life of Jesus Christ. Now, the wise men of the Parthian nobility and their priesthood were known as the magi, and we know from Matthew 2:1 that wise men, or magos in the Greek, from the east came to visit Jesus when he was born. Now, Herod the Great, known for his cruelty, is surprisingly deferential to the Magi when they inquire of him who was born of the King of the Jews. Now, this is only understandable in light of the relations at the time between Rome and Parthia and Caesar's policy of not provoking the Parthians. Now, Matthew 2:3, it says that all Jerusalem was troubled when the Magi arrived in Jerusalem. Now, it was a very public affair. Now, given the Now, given the treasures they presented to Jesus, which would have later been used to fund his ministry, it is likely that there would have been a huge escort of perhaps several thousand Parthian soldiers to protect these Parthian nobles and treasures that they brought with them. Now, Caesar's policy of not provoking the Parthians also helps to explain the reluctance of both Herod Antipas and the bloodthirsty Pontius Pilate to have Jesus killed. It was like the two rulers were playing pass the parcel in an Irish pub when they tried to pass the buck on being the one to convict Jesus. Now, they were well aware of the interest that the Parthian Magi had shown in him and desperately avoided being the one to convict Jesus. Now, Pilate's public act of washing his hand was an attempt to avoid personal responsibility of Jesus' death as demanded by the crowd that refused to relent. Now, one of Mary's relatives, most likely a cousin, was Elizabeth, who was married to a man named Zecharias, who was a Levitical priest. Now, they were getting on in years and had not had any children. Now, about 15 months before Jesus Christ was born, Zecharias' rostered time to finally serve in the temple came up. Now, when he was burning incense, an angel suddenly appeared and told him that he would have a son. Now, notice the angel says that your prayer has been heard. Now, we actually have recorded in the Jewish Mishnah a record of the actual prayer that the priest would offer when he would burn incense at the altar of incense. And it says, "Send us the one who will prepare the way for the coming of the Lord." Now, this was the prayer that was answered, and it was Zecharias' son John who would be the one to prepare the way for the Lord. Now, here is a rough family tree that I drew up showing the family connections of Jesus Christ. Now, you'll see on Mary's side, Elizabeth, who gave birth to John the Baptist. Now, another relative on Mary's side of the family was her sister Salome, who was married to Zebedee. Now, they were the parents of the two prominent apostles, James and John, who wrote the gospel and epistles that bear his name. So James and John were both cousins of Jesus Christ. Now, John's brother James was not the James who wrote the epistle of James. That epistle was written by one of Jesus' brothers, his half-brother, James, who was only converted after the resurrection. And he eventually became the pastor of the Jerusalem church after the other apostles had moved outside of Judea. Now, one of Jesus' other half-brothers was Jude or Judah, who wrote the Epistle of Jude. Now, the names in Greek of Jesus' half-brothers are James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Now, the Hebrew Aramaic version of those names are Jacob, Joseph, Simeon, and Judah. Now, in addition to those four half-brothers, Jesus actually had more than one sister, as noted in Matthew 13 and verse 56. Now, on Joseph's side of the family, Joseph had a brother named Alphaeus or Clopas in Latin. Now, he was married to another Mary, and they had a son named James, who was another of the 12 apostles. Now this James was the James called James the Less. Now, in Mark 6 verse 3, Jesus is called a carpenter, and in Matthew 13:56 it states that Jesus was the carpenter's son. Now, the Greek indicates that Mark's version is properly translated, so it appears that Jesus for a time did learn the same trade from his father Joseph. Now, the Greek word translated carpenter is the word tekton. It simply means a builder. Now, a master builder was referred to as an architecton, which is the root of our word architect. Now, when tekton was translated into English in the 1600s, in the King James Bible, the primary building material in England was wood. However, the vast majority of building in Israel is done with stone, not wood. So Joseph would have been more likely a stonemason, though carpentry would have been a smaller subset of his trade. Now, as indicated in Mark 6:3, Jesus was probably taught his father's trade during his teenage years. Now, it is often assumed that the Samaritans were Gentiles, but the New Testament writers seem to imply the opposite. Now, in Matthew 15:24, Jesus said that he was only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Yet it says in John 4 that Jesus needed to go through Samaria, where he met the woman at the well. And then we also see Philip preaching to the people of Samaria in Acts chapter 8, 2 chapters before the first official Gentile converts in Acts chapter 10. Now, Jewish scholar Chaim Schaus, in his book The Jewish Festival, says this about the Samaritans. Now, modern historical research has proved that the Samaritans are not descendants of the heathen colonists settled in the northern kingdom of Israel by the conquerors of Samaria, as was once assumed, nor are they to be identified with Nehemiah's opponents of the Persian period. Actually, the Samaritans of today are a small and poor remnant of an old and great Jewish sect that appeared in Palestine about the beginning of the Greek period. They form the oldest Jewish sect in existence, end of quote. Now, regardless of whether they were fully Israelite or of mixed race, they appear to have had enough Israelite blood for Jesus and the apostles to preach to before the door of salvation was then later opened to the Gentiles. Now, in the land of Israel, the most common language was Aramaic. Now, Jesus would normally be speaking Aramaic in his everyday speaking, though Hebrew was often spoken in the synagogues. Now, Aramaic is quite similar to Hebrew, but with some differences, kind of like the difference between Dutch and the languages of Afrikaans and Flemish. For example, in Hebrew, the word for son is ben, but in Aramaic it is bar, as in a bar mitzvah. Now also, when Jesus was on the cross, he said, "My God, why have you forsaken me?" Now, the Aramaic words recorded in the Gospels, if you look them up, actually differ from the Hebrew words that are written in Psalm 22, verse 1. Now, in Italy, Latin was the local language, but Greek was the most common language throughout the Roman Empire, much like English in the Western world today. So most people in the empire would know their own local language, like Aramaic or Latin, and they would converse with locals in that language. Now, if you were speaking with someone from a different part of the empire, most people would know Greek, and that would allow communication between people of other parts of the empire. Now, here is Leonardo da Vinci's painting of how he imagined Jesus' Last Supper, which the Gospels refer to as the Passover. And here is the social distancing version of that same Last Supper painting. Now, did the seating arrangement look like this with tables and chairs, or did it look something different? Well, in the first century, such feasts were held around a U-shaped, three-sided low structure introduced by the Romans called a triclinium that those feasting would recline on, with the food served on the inside, which would probably today be called finger food and often eaten with pieces of bread. Now, this explains why John was resting on Jesus' bosom or chest. Now, the triclinium also helps to explain the two occasions where women anoint Jesus' feet when he's dining with others. Now, the women weren't under the table, but were on the outside of the triclinium. Now, it says with one of the women that Jesus looked behind him. He didn't look down under the table. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the historical side of things. Now, Scott Ashley has done an excellent series surveying the Gospels for the Ambassador Bible College. Now, you can access the lectures on the ABC website, or you can get to it via the UCG archive that is found on our local fellowship site at fellowship.ucg.org.au/UCG-archive. And we've designed this to be a one-stop place where you can access and also search for anything that's in our UCG material. And one final resource that I want to recommend is this book that is hands down the best book out there covering the historical and archaeological background to the Bible. It's the Handbook of Bible Archaeology by Randall Price. Now, I hope what I've shared here helps to give you a good foundation to better understand the Gospels as we dive into them over the coming sessions. Thanks for your attention, everyone, and I'll hand the study back to Joe.